By mid-1945, Japan was a dying empire fighting a war it could no longer win. Its navy lay at the bottom of the Pacific, its air force reduced to a desperate handful of kamikaze pilots, and its cities, once proud symbols of industrial might, now burned night after night under the glow of American firebombs. The Pacific War had begun nearly 4 years earlier with a roar of victory. Japan's armies swept across Asia, from China to the Philippines, from Burma to the islands of the South Pacific. Their soldiers were relentless, disciplined, and loyal beyond measure. But by 1945, the tide had reversed. The once unstoppable empire was surrounded, starving, and running on illusion. American industry, guided by sheer volume and innovation, had overwhelmed Japan's ability to fight. By the spring of 1945, U.S. forces under General Douglas MacArthur had captured the Philippines, cutting Japan off from vital resources. In the north, Admiral Chester Nimitz's Pacific Fleet crushed Japanese defenses island by island. Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, each one drawing the war closer to Japan's home soil. But Japan refused to surrender. Even as its people starved and its cities turned to rubble, the leadership clung to one plan, Operation Ketsugo, the final defense of the home islands. Millions of soldiers, civilians, and even schoolchildren were being prepared to fight to the death. Women were trained to attack tanks with bamboo spears. Pilots volunteered to die in suicide dives. The nation's ideology was clear: death before surrender. Inside Japan's Supreme War Council, the split was widening. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, supported by a few senior officials, believed Japan's only chance was peace through diplomacy. He sought a way to surrender without total humiliation, to preserve the emperor's position and avoid occupation. But the army's leadership, men like General Korichika Anami and General Yoshijiro Umezu, were unshakable. They still believed in the myth of decisive battle, that somehow if America invaded Japan, they could inflict such massive casualties that Washington would offer better terms. President Harry S. Truman, new to the office after Roosevelt's death in April, saw the war differently. Every day of delay meant thousands more dead, American and Japanese alike. The invasion of Japan, codenamed Operation Downfall, promised to be the bloodiest in human history. Allied planners estimated over 1 million Allied casualties and perhaps 10 million Japanese deaths. By June, the United States had already unleashed an air campaign that dwarfed anything the world had ever seen. General Curtis LeMay's B-29 bombers turned Tokyo, Osaka, and Kobe into oceans of flame. On the night of March 9, 1945, Tokyo burned with such intensity that asphalt streets melted, and over 100,000 civilians died in a single night. Still no surrender came. The Japanese government justified it through silence, believing that endurance was itself victory. But inside the American leadership, patience was wearing thin. Truman, Secretary of War Henry Stimson, and a select few scientists and military officers had just completed a secret project that promised to end the war without an invasion, the Manhattan Project. After the successful test in the New Mexico desert on July 16, 1945, the atomic age was born. The power of the sun itself had been harnessed into a weapon small enough to be carried by a single bomber. Truman described it simply as a destroyer of worlds. At the Potsdam Conference in late July, Truman, Churchill, and Chiang Kai-shek issued a warning. "We call upon Japan to surrender unconditionally, or face prompt and utter destruction." Tokyo ignored it. The War Council dismissed the declaration as a mere threat. But within 2 weeks, that threat would become a reality, one so overwhelming that the entire concept of warfare would change forever. On August 6, 1945, a B-29 bomber named Enola Gay appeared in the skies over Hiroshima. At 8:15 a.m., it released a single bomb. Little Boy. In seconds, a city of 350,000 people vanished beneath a column of fire 4 miles high. Tens of thousands were vaporized instantly. Within minutes, 80% of Hiroshima ceased to exist. Yet even then, Tokyo's War Council hesitated. Reports were incomplete, communications severed. The generals refused to believe that one bomb could destroy an entire city. They assumed multiple waves of new incendiary bombs had been used. Censors suppressed the news to prevent panic. But that silence, that denial, would last only 3 days. Because as Japan struggled to understand what had just happened, two new catastrophes were about to strike, one from the West and one from the heart of America's growing atomic power. The morning of August 7, 1945 began with disbelief. Japan's communication networks were in chaos. Entire cities had been bombed before, but nothing like this. The few surviving officers from Hiroshima described a light brighter than the sun, a single flash that leveled buildings, incinerated people, and left behind shadows burned into stone. Yet the Central Command dismissed it as exaggeration. They called it a new type of incendiary. Across the Pacific, however, there was no confusion. President Harry Truman, aboard the cruiser USS Augusta, had already drafted his announcement. His words were calm, clinical, and world-changing. A short time ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima and destroyed its usefulness to the enemy. It is an atomic bomb. It is a harnessing of the basic power of the universe. The world had entered a new era of warfare. But inside Japan's Imperial General Headquarters, the shock had not yet settled. The scientists advising the War Ministry, including Yoshio Nishina, Japan's leading nuclear physicist, examined reports and photographs from Hiroshima. Within a day, they confirmed the unthinkable. America had developed a nuclear weapon. Nishina whispered to his colleagues, "It is the atomic bomb." Still, the army insisted that Japan must fight on. They believed the Americans could not possibly have more than one or two such weapons. If Japan could endure the next few weeks, perhaps they could still negotiate favorable surrender terms through the Soviet Union, which was officially neutral under the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact of 1941. But in Moscow, Joseph Stalin had already made his move. During the Yalta Conference months earlier, he had promised to enter the Pacific War 3 months after Germany's defeat. That deadline arrived on August 8, 1945. At midnight, the Red Army unleashed Operation August Storm, a colossal assault on Japanese forces in Manchuria. Over 1.5 million Soviet troops, 5,000 tanks, and 3,700 aircraft struck the Kwantung Army, once the pride of Imperial Japan. The result was instantaneous collapse. Entire divisions were surrounded within days. Japan's defensive structure in Asia disintegrated. For Tokyo's leadership, it was a nightmare. The plan to use Moscow as a peace broker vanished overnight. Japan was now trapped, facing nuclear destruction from the United States and invasion from the Soviet Union. Then, on August 9th, while the War Council met to discuss the catastrophe in Manchuria, another message arrived. Nagasaki had been destroyed. At 11:02 a.m., a B-29 named Boxcar dropped the second atomic bomb, Fat Man, over the industrial valley of Nagasaki. The blast yielded a force even greater than Hiroshima's. A city of 250,000 disappeared beneath a mushroom cloud. Tens of thousands died instantly. Thousands more perished in the fires that followed. Within hours, the Japanese government received a coded message from U.S. forces. A subtle, deliberate psychological strike. It warned that more atomic bombs were ready, and that continued resistance would bring the complete destruction of the Japanese nation. This was not entirely true. In reality, the United States had only one more atomic bomb ready for deployment in the coming weeks. But Tokyo didn't know that. To them, it sounded like the sky itself had turned against them. Inside the Imperial Palace, the War Council met again that evening. The atmosphere was suffocating. 6 men, the most powerful in Japan, as argued for hours. Half demanded surrender, half demanded one last battle. They feared not the loss of life, but the shame of occupation. The word surrender itself felt unbearable. Meanwhile, air raid sirens continued to echo across Tokyo, reminding them of the inferno outside. The emperor listened quietly, his face unreadable. That night, for the first time in Japan's modern history, the War Council reached a deadlock, a split that even tradition could not bridge. The bombs had changed everything, yet pride still held the empire hostage. But as dawn approached, a new voice would enter the discussion, one that had remained silent through the entire war. The voice of Emperor Hirohito himself, and his decision, guided by the threat of yet another atomic strike, would determine not just the fate of Japan, but the course of the entire 20th century. In the days after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan's human world simply stopped moving. The survivors called it Pikadan, flash boom. They spoke of a sky that turned white, a wind that peeled skin, and a silence that followed so deep that even the birds were gone. Doctors and nurses stumbled through streets littered with glass and burned bodies. Shadows of people who once stood on bridges or steps were seared permanently into stone. There were no words for it. No enemy to hate, no battle to fight. It was annihilation without form. In Hiroshima, a Buddhist monk wrote, "We thought the world had ended. But the sun rose again and we realized only our city had." Japan's ordinary citizens had already endured months of nightly firebombing. But this was beyond imagination. Those who lived could no longer understand what survival meant. Hospitals overflowed with radiation victims, though no one yet understood radiation itself. Families searched for loved ones who had simply turned to dust. And yet in Tokyo, the generals still talked of continuing the war. The gap between the suffering of the people and the pride of the leadership had never been wider. For most of the war, Emperor Hirohito had remained distant. A divine symbol, not a decision-maker. His voice was never heard by the public, his presence more myth than man. But in August 1945, the myth began to fracture. After Hiroshima, Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo pleaded for an immediate end to the war. He warned the emperor that further delay would mean Japan's extinction. Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki, weary and cautious, supported him quietly. But the military, led by War Minister General Korechika Anami, still demanded one more battle, one final sacrifice to preserve national honor. The emperor listened as his advisors spoke of new weapons, secret defenses, and the need for courage. He looked out over the ruined gardens of his palace and said little. But those closest to him sensed his fear, not for himself, but for his people. Behind closed doors, he told his aides, "If we continue, the nation will be reduced to ashes." Hirohito's words carried the quiet weight of finality. He had watched the divine empire he inherited crumble into ruin, and he knew the next bomb would not distinguish palace from city. For the first time, the emperor's will began to move toward surrender, a thought still considered heresy by his generals. To Japan's armed forces, surrender was worse than death. The Bushido Code, the warrior's path, demanded absolute loyalty even in defeat. Generations of soldiers had been taught that capture was shameful, that the emperor's enemies were not human. The kamikaze pilots of Okinawa and Iwo Jima had proved this loyalty through death. Their legacy now haunted every officer in Tokyo. If they had died smiling, how could the generals live through surrender? General Anami, though deeply conflicted, reflected that belief. He feared surrender would destroy the soul of Japan. The army, he argued, must fight until the homeland was drenched in American blood. Only then could peace be accepted with honor. Even after 2 atomic bombs, many within the high command still planned for Operation Ketsugo, the decisive homeland battle. They believed America had only a few bombs left, and that an invasion would cost the Allies dearly. Their logic was brutal but simple. If Japan could make the invasion too costly, perhaps they could still negotiate the preservation of the imperial system. But while the military clung to ideals of sacrifice, the emperor was beginning to see something they did not, that the world had changed beyond the reach of Bushido. A new kind of weapon had erased the meaning of battle itself, and that realization would soon force the emperor to step out of the shadows for the first time in his life, to decide between pride and survival. Japan's scientists were among the first to grasp the scale of what had happened at Hiroshima. Physicist Yoshio Nishina, who had once collaborated with Niels Bohr before the war, was summoned by the army to investigate. When he returned from Hiroshima, his report was stark and brief. "This is not a chemical explosion. The city was destroyed by atomic fission." Until that moment, few in Tokyo had believed such a weapon could exist. Japan had begun its own nuclear research during the war, the NIGO project, but it was underfunded, starved of uranium, and crippled by Allied bombings. Now faced with Hiroshima's ashes, the scientific community understood that the United States had crossed into a realm of power once reserved for gods. Military engineers calculated the energy needed to destroy a city. The numbers were incomprehensible. To vaporize steel, stone, and bone in an instant, no explosive known to man could achieve that. The Americans had not merely built a bomb, they had rewritten the definition of war. For Japan's leaders, this realization came too late. Their entire defense strategy, based on attrition, courage, and sacrifice in what was obsolete. No number of soldiers could fight the light that fell from the sky, and with every hour that passed, the fear grew that more atomic bombs waited beyond the clouds. As Japan's high command debated surrender, the United States opened a new front, the War of Fear. Days after Hiroshima, American bombers began dropping leaflets over Japanese cities. The messages were clear, precise, and terrifying. We are in possession of the most destructive explosive ever devised. One of our bombs has the explosive power of 2,000 B-29s. If you value your lives, evacuate your cities. Tens of millions of these leaflets fluttered down across Japan's countryside. People read them silently, clutching the papers in disbelief. Mothers hid them in walls. Soldiers burned them in shame. The message spread faster than fire. America had found a weapon capable of ending not just armies but nations. In Washington, President Truman reinforced the fear. His public statement promised a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth. The choice he offered was not surrender or defeat. It was survival or extinction. American psychological warfare experts knew exactly what they were doing. Japan's military leaders might reject diplomacy, but they could not reject terror. By combining the atomic attacks with leaflet warnings, intercepted radio transmissions, and rumors of more bombs, the U.S. made Japan believe the next target could be Tokyo itself. Even without dropping another atomic bomb, the psychological pressure was crushing. When the War Council met on August 9th, they no longer debated victory, only the manner of Japan's death. In those final days, the question haunting every leader in Tokyo was no longer about strategy, but about meaning. Could surrender ever be honorable? And could fighting on still be moral? Japan's ancient code of loyalty demanded resistance to the end, yet the suffering of its people had reached unimaginable levels. Entire cities had ceased to exist. Millions were homeless. Food was gone. Epidemics were spreading. And still the army demanded that civilians prepare to fight invaders with sticks and stones. Foreign Minister Togo saw the truth most clearly. "We must stop this," he told the emperor. "If we do not surrender, our nation will be annihilated." Yet others saw surrender as betrayal, not of politics but of spirit. For General Anami and his circle, it was better to die as warriors than to live as subjects of occupation. Even as the bombs fell, even as the sky turned to fire, they dreamed of a glorious death in the end. This moral struggle, between the duty to protect life and the duty to protect honor, defined the final days of Japan's war. It was a conflict deeper than ideology or politics. It was the death of an identity, thousands of years in the making, and within hours, that struggle would reach its breaking point in a single midnight meeting inside the Imperial Palace, where the emperor would do what no emperor had done before: speak his will aloud. Tokyo, night of August 9-10, 1945, the war room beneath the Imperial Palace was suffocating. Cigarette smoke mixed with the heavy scent of sweat and dust. Outside, the air raid sirens wailed faintly through the humid night. Inside, Japan's 6 most powerful men faced the choice that would decide their nation's fate. It was nearly midnight. The Supreme War Council, the Big Six, had gathered again. Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki, Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, Navy Minister Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai, and War Minister General Korichika Anami, joined by Chiefs of Staff General Yoshijiro Umezu and Admiral Soemu Toyota. They sat around a low wooden table, its surface littered with maps, telegrams, and burned cigarette ends. The tension was unbearable. The emperor waited nearby in a separate chamber. He had not yet spoken, but his presence was felt in every word. At 10:30 p.m., the meeting began. Foreign Minister Togo was first to speak. He read aloud the terms of the Potsdam Declaration, emphasizing that the Allies demanded unconditional surrender, but made no mention of abolishing the emperor's position. He pleaded for acceptance, warning that every hour of delay meant more lives lost and the possibility of a third atomic strike. Then General Anami rose. His voice was calm but unyielding. He argued that the atomic bomb was just another weapon. Terrible, yes, but not decisive. "If we must perish," he said, "let us perish gloriously." He called for continuation of the war under Operation Ketsugo, the final homeland defense. If the Americans invade, We shall make them bleed so much they will offer better terms. His words drew nods from Umezu and Toyota. They spoke of the Soviet invasion but downplayed its importance. The army still believed they could repel an Allied landing. Their faith was not in victory but in sacrifice, the belief that death could still preserve dignity. But the others, Suzuki, Togo, and Yonai, had already accepted the inevitable. They spoke of starvation, of burned cities, of the emperor's people living among ashes. They warned that one more bomb could erase Tokyo itself. Hours passed. No agreement was reached. The council was deadlocked, 3 against 3. Finally, Prime Minister Suzuki did something unprecedented. He turned to the Imperial Chamberlain and whispered, "We must ask His Majesty to decide." The doors opened. Emperor Hirohito entered the war room. Every man rose and bowed low, eyes averted. The emperor was not supposed to intervene in politics. His role was divine, ceremonial. But tonight he would break that tradition. He moved slowly, dressed in a plain uniform. His face was pale, his voice soft but firm. He listened once more to both sides, those pleading for surrender and those demanding resistance. Then he spoke. "I have given serious thought to the situation at home and abroad," he said quietly. "The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. I cannot bear to see my innocent people suffer any longer. To continue the war would mean the destruction of the nation and the obliteration of human civilization." The room fell silent. No one dared speak. For the first time in Japan's modern history, an emperor had expressed his will not to fight, but to surrender. It was an act of moral courage and of political shock. Even General Anami, the symbol of resistance, lowered his head in tears. He whispered, "If His Majesty so wishes, I have nothing more to say." At 2 a.m. the meeting concluded. The emperor's decision was final. Japan would accept the Potsdam Declaration with one condition: the preservation of the imperial institution. But even as the decision was made, danger still lurked. Hardline officers within the army were furious. They saw surrender as betrayal. In their eyes, the emperor had been misled by weak politicians. Whispers began spreading through the corridors of the palace, whispers of rebellion. The war was not yet over. The next 48 hours would decide whether Japan surrendered peacefully or tore itself apart from within. And across the Pacific, in Washington, President Truman prepared his next message, one designed to ensure that Japan's surrender was absolute, and that no trace of resistance remained. Tokyo, August 12, 1945, Japan was falling apart. The emperor had spoken, yet his words had not reached the people. Not officially, not yet. In the shadows of Tokyo's war-ravaged streets, a new and deadly plan was taking shape. A coup d'etat designed to overturn the emperor's surrender and plunge the nation into one final, suicidal war. It was called the Kyujo Incident. Night of August 12th. At the Army Ministry, a young and fanatical officer named Major Kenji Hatanaka could no longer bear it. He had heard that the government planned to broadcast the emperor's surrender message within days, a message recorded secretly on wax discs. To Hatanaka, this was unthinkable. How could Japan, land of the gods, surrender to the barbarians who had burned her cities and slaughtered her people? He gathered like-minded men, Captain Takeo Sasaki, Lieutenant Colonel Masataka Ida, and others, desperate officers who believed it was their duty to protect the emperor from traitors. Their plan was simple and insane. Seize the Imperial Palace, destroy the surrender recording, and convince the army to continue the fight. They moved quietly, forging orders in the name of the Eastern Army commander, General Shizuichi Tanaka, to mobilize troops. By midnight, the 2nd Regiment of the 1st Imperial Guards Division surrounded the palace gates. Soldiers loyal to Hatanaka took positions. The palace, symbol of divine rule, was now under siege by its own defenders. Inside, confusion erupted. The imperial household staff, loyal servants and chamberlains, didn't know who to trust. Guards stood with rifles at the ready, unsure if they were protecting or imprisoning their emperor. In a small soundproof room, Emperor Hirohito's surrender speech, the Gyokon Hoso, had been recorded hours earlier. It was the first time the people of Japan would ever hear his voice. 2 discs, each holding the emperor's trembling but resolute words, were carefully placed in a safe and hidden by palace officials. When Hatanaka's men stormed the building, they searched frantically, overturning cabinets, breaking doors, interrogating servants, but the recordings were gone. The emperor's words had vanished into the labyrinth of the palace. They failed to find them. Elsewhere in Tokyo at dawn, General Anami Korichika sat in his office. He knew of the coup. He had been approached by the conspirators earlier that night. They begged him to lead the rebellion, to rally the army, to save Japan's honor. But Anami refused. His loyalty to the emperor was absolute. He believed that by surrendering, Japan could preserve at least its soul, if not its pride. He told them, "As a soldier, my life belongs to His Majesty." As morning light crept through the paper windows, Anami took up his short sword, the one his father had carried, and performed seppuku, the ritual suicide of the samurai. He left behind a simple note. "I, with my death, humbly apologize to His Majesty for the great crime." It was both confession and protest, and a sign that the old Japan was dying with him. Morning of August 15th, 1945. Chaos still gripped the palace. The rebels held the gates, but their leadership was fracturing. General Tanaka, whose name they had forged, arrived in person, furious. He demanded to know why troops had been deployed without his orders. When Hatanaka tried to justify his actions, Tanaka shouted, "You fool! Do you wish to be remembered as a traitor?" Realizing the coup had failed, Hatanaka fled on his motorcycle through the streets of Tokyo. He stopped briefly near the NHK Broadcasting Building, the same station that would soon air the emperor's voice. There, as the morning sun rose over a city in ruins, he drew his pistol and shot himself in the head. In his pocket, police later found a note. "I have nothing to regret. Long live the emperor." At noon, August 15, 1945, every radio in Japan fell silent. At precisely 12 p.m., static crackled. And then a voice the Japanese people had never heard before. It was high-pitched, formal, and filled with sorrow. The Emperor of Japan was speaking to his subjects. After pondering deeply the general trends of the world and the actual conditions obtaining in our empire today, we have decided to effect a settlement of the present situation by resorting to an extraordinary measure. He never used the word surrender. Instead, he said Japan must endure the unendurable. He spoke of the atomic bomb, a new and most cruel bomb, and of his duty to protect the future of his people. Millions listened in stunned silence. Many wept, others raged, some simply knelt in the ashes of what had been their homes. In Manchuria, soldiers threw down their rifles. In China and the Pacific, weary troops stared at their radios, unable to believe what they heard. The war was over. That night, across the world in Washington and London, crowds cheered in the streets. Newspapers blared, "Japan surrenders." In the Pacific, sailors fired flares into the sky. And in Tokyo, under a dark, humid sky, Emperor Hirohito sat alone in his chamber, listening to the same broadcast, his own voice echoing faintly from a distant radio. He had broken 2,600 years of imperial tradition to save his nation. And yet he knew Japan would never be the same again. The samurai code had ended. The age of surrender had begun. Tokyo Bay, September 2, 1945. The morning was calm. A thin mist drifted across the steel-gray water of Tokyo Bay, where the massive silhouette of the USS Missouri lay anchored. Her deck was spotless, polished for history. Above her, the stars and stripes fluttered in the cool Pacific wind. This was the stage of Japan's final surrender. Aboard the battleship stood the men who had led the Allies to victory: General Douglas MacArthur, Admiral Nimitz, Admiral Halsey, and representatives from Britain, China, Australia, Canada, France, the Netherlands, and New Zealand. Before them, a small group of Japanese officials ascended the gangway. Leading them was Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu, his face grim, a cane in his hand, a relic from a wound received in an earlier war. Beside him walked General Yoshijiro Umezu, representing the Imperial Japanese Army. They moved in silence, every step heavy with the weight of a nation's defeat. The ceremony began precisely at 9:02 a.m. MacArthur stood at the podium, his voice steady and cold. "We are gathered here, representatives of the major warring powers, to conclude a solemn agreement whereby peace may be restored." As Shigemitsu signed the instrument of surrender, Cameras clicked. The pen trembled slightly in his hand. Each stroke marked the end of the Japanese Empire, an empire that had stretched from Manchuria to the Solomon Islands, now reduced to ashes. When General Umezu added his signature, MacArthur stepped forward and signed for the Allied powers. Then one by one, each nation's representative followed, symbolizing the united force that had brought Japan to its knees. As the final name was written, MacArthur turned to the gathered witnesses and said, "Let us pray that peace be now restored to the world, and that God will preserve it always." A moment of stillness followed. Then, from every ship in the harbor, a thunderous roar erupted, horns, sirens, and salutes shaking the air. Across the world, millions listened on radios as the words echoed, "The war is over." But for Japan, the war's end was not the end of suffering. The nation lay in ruins, 66 major cities destroyed, over 3 million dead. Nearly 10 million homeless. Tokyo was a sea of rubble. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, once thriving centers of industry and culture, were ghost cities. Radiation sickness spread silently through the survivors, many unaware that the invisible poison would haunt them for decades. The Japanese army, once numbering millions, was disbanded overnight. Soldiers returned home on crowded trains carrying nothing but the shame of defeat. Entire villages waited for fathers and sons who would never return. In the weeks that followed, General MacArthur assumed command as Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, SCAP. He walked the streets of Tokyo without bodyguards, a deliberate gesture of authority. The Japanese people watched him in awe. Many bowed as he passed, unsure if this tall, calm man now ruled in place of their emperor. MacArthur's mission was unlike any in history, to rebuild Japan from ruins, but also to reshape its soul. He ordered food supplies from the United States to prevent starvation. He oversaw the release of political prisoners. And then, with the same precision he had brought to the battlefield, he began rewriting Japan's future. Meanwhile, Emperor Hirohito remained in the Imperial Palace, a silent figure under tight supervision. There were calls, especially from Australia and the Soviet Union, to put him on trial as a war criminal. But MacArthur refused. He believed the emperor could serve as a bridge between the old Japan and the new, a symbol of unity and surrender. Under strict guidance, Hirohito was persuaded to renounce his divinity, declaring himself no longer a living god but a human being. On January 1st, 1946, in a voice still frail yet composed, he told his people, "The ties between us and our people have always stood upon mutual trust and affection. The myth that the emperor is divine is false." For the first time in 2 millennia, Japan's emperor was mortal, and the empire of the rising sun had become a nation under occupation. Yet even in defeat, a strange peace settled over the land. The guns were silent. The skies, once filled with bombers, now carried only clouds. From the ashes of surrender, Japan would begin a transformation no one could have imagined. But that transformation began in silence, in the realization that the nuclear age had rewritten the rules of survival, and that silence echoed far beyond Japan's shores. Hiroshima, autumn 1945. The city that once hummed with trams and laughter was now a wasteland of twisted iron and scorched stone. Beneath the skeletal dome of the Prefectural Industrial Hall, what would later be called the Genbaku Dome, the air still carried the faint metallic scent of burned flesh. Children wandered through the ruins, silent, barefoot, eyes hollow. Doctors worked in open fields because the hospitals no longer existed. Those who had survived the blast were dying slowly, from burns, from sickness, from something unseen. Japanese scientists called it atomic poison. The Americans called it radiation sickness. Hair fell out in clumps. Skin peeled away like paper. Even months later, when the fires had cooled, people still collapsed without warning. The survivors, hibakusha as they came to be known, would carry the scars for generations. For Japan, the atomic bomb was not just a weapon. It was the line between two worlds, one of old wars and one of new fears. Across the Pacific, the United States was beginning to realize what it had unleashed. When President Truman authorized the use of the bomb, he called it the greatest achievement of science in history. But after the mushroom clouds rose, the tone shifted. American scientists who had built the bomb, men like J. Robert Oppenheimer, began to question whether they had opened the gates to something uncontrollable. Oppenheimer, standing before a congressional committee, whispered words from the Bhagavad Gita. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The world had entered the nuclear age. Every major power, the Soviet Union, Britain, soon China, would race to build their own bombs. The peace bought by Hiroshima and Nagasaki came not from trust, but from fear. The fear that another war would mean the end of civilization itself. In Japan, under MacArthur's direction, a new nation began to take shape. The 1947 Constitution, written largely by American officials but approved by Japanese reformers, forever changed the country's destiny. Its most famous clause, Article 9, declared, "The Japanese people forever renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation, and the threat or use of force as means of settling international disputes." The army that once marched across Asia was gone. In its place rose factories, schools, and a new spirit, one not of conquest but of creation. American food aid turned famine into stability. War orphans filled classrooms rebuilt from rubble. The same people who once forged weapons now built cameras, radios, and cars. And slowly, Japan began its economic miracle. By the 1950s, the cities glowed with neon instead of fire. By the 1960s, Japanese ships once again sailed across the Pacific, this time carrying goods, not soldiers. Within 2 decades, the same nation that had been flattened by atomic bombs became one of the world's strongest economies. But even as Japan rebuilt, the shadows of Hiroshima and Nagasaki never disappeared. Every August, sirens still sound at 8:15 a.m. in Hiroshima. People bow their heads in silence as the peace bell tolls. The names of new victims, those who have died from long-term radiation, are added to the registry. In Nagasaki, the blackened remains of Urakami Cathedral stand as a reminder of what faith endured beneath the fire. And in schools across Japan, children learn about the war not as glory, but as tragedy. The atomic bomb had ended the Second World War, but it had also ended something deeper: the illusion that humanity could control its own violence. In the ashes of 1945, the world saw its reflection, brilliant, powerful, and terrifying. For Japan, surrender was not simply defeat. It was transformation. A nation once defined by its sword had now become defined by its peace, and yet, every flicker of a nuclear test, every rising tension between nations, still echoes that moment in 1945, when the sky over Hiroshima turned white, and the world crossed the threshold of its own destruction. In the end, Japan's resistance did not collapse from invasion. It collapsed under the weight of a new reality. The nuclear age had arrived, and with it came the understanding that war itself had changed forever. For centuries, empires had risen and fallen through fire, ambition, and human will. But in August 1945, mankind learned that a single act of violence could erase an entire city. That power had finally outgrown control. The Japanese people, once driven by a code that celebrated death over defeat, found themselves forced to choose life over annihilation. It was not cowardice that ended their war, it was survival. And that choice, painful and humiliating as it seemed at the time, allowed Japan to live again. The threat of nuclear destruction became the world's greatest peacekeeper. The very horror that consumed Hiroshima and Nagasaki would paradoxically prevent global war for generations. Nations learned to fear the weapon more than they hated each other. In Tokyo, the emperor remained on his throne, no longer divine, but human. Around him, a nation rebuilt itself from ashes, trading swords for tools and discipline for innovation. The same precision once used to wage war would soon produce the technologies, cars, and culture that defined modern Japan. And yet, beneath every triumph, the ghosts of 1945 linger. Each year, when the peace bells ring in Hiroshima, they echo not just for Japan's dead, but for all of humanity. A warning and a prayer. A warning that the greatest weapons ever built should never again be used. A prayer that the lesson of that summer, when resistance met the atom, will never be forgotten. Because in that moment, as the light over Hiroshima burned brighter than the sun, the world saw the future it had created and understood, perhaps for the first time, that survival itself was now the ultimate victory. The dawn that rose over the ashes of Japan was not just the end of a war. It was the beginning of an age.